Alright, so now we have this video called How Did France Lose in Mexico? Having to do with the French invasion and conquest of Mexico in the 1860s. This topic has a sort of special meaning for me as I covered it very heavily in my master's thesis, and it became sort of a zone of contention between me and my professor, which I will get into later, I promise. But for now, let's start the video.
Hi, I'm Griffin Johnson, the Armchair Historian. Today's video, how France fought Mexico to put an Austrian into power only to be stopped by the United States. I promise it'll all make sense soon. I'm very pleased to announce that today's video is sponsored by the Great Courses Plus. More on that later. The Franco-Mexican War might seem like somewhat of a strange conflict, but you might be surprised to find out that this wasn't the first time that France and Mexico went to war, and in the same century, too. The one we're covering today is the second of these conflicts, typically referred to as the Second French Intervention in Mexico. Unfortunately, we don't have a witty sobriquet to refer to it as, like the Pastry War, which was what the first intervention came to be known as. But funny nicknames aside, today we'll be discussing the prelude, course, and aftermath of the war that would be the beginning of the end for Napoleon III's imperial ambitions. Between 1857 and 1861, Mexico was embroiled in a civil war, fought between the conservatives, who espoused the Catholic Church and the central government, and the liberals, who espoused democracy and equality. The conflict began after the conservatives, who were unhappy with the results of the election and the reforms being instituted, rose up in revolt against the liberals. In 1861, the liberals won the war, with Benito Juarez being recognized as president and bringing an end to the bloodshed in Mexico forever. Except that wasn't the end of it. See, during the Civil War, both sides borrowed a lot of money from Spain, France, and Great Britain. When the liberals won, these powers expected them to pay compensation, not only for the money that they borrowed, but for the money the conservatives also borrowed. The liberals weren't enthusiastic about the idea, to say the least, so the European powers decided that they would seize their recompense instead. The plan was simple: strong-arm Mexico into paying for the wall. Wait, that's not right. Strong-arm Mexico into paying for the war. But Napoleon III had other plans. After all, he had a lot to live up to. His intention was not to simply collect debts, but to take over all of Mexico. And to do that, he would need a monarch who would serve as his puppet. That's precisely where Archduke Maximilian comes in, a Habsburg who had been approached by Mexican monarchists before and could claim to be the rightful ruler of the now defunct territory in New Spain. In December 1861, the European coalition comprising France, Great Britain, and Spain captured Veracruz with little to no resistance. Exact numbers are hard to come by, but we believe that the invading force numbered some 6,000 men, whereas the Mexican army could only field some 3,000 men at the time. With such a hefty numerical advantage, the Europeans crept ever closer to Mexico City, capturing 3 cities along the way. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, another French fleet arrived, capturing Campeche in February 1862. That cleared the way for an entirely new French army to land in April under the command of General Charles de Lorenzo. This army came not to collect debt, but to begin the conquest of the country. Napoleon III had thereby revealed his hand, and the British and Spanish decided that they would have none of it. I mean, did you really expect that the French and British would be able to work together? By the end of the month, only French troops remained on Mexican soil. France had to secure its precarious position while reinforcements were shipped across the Atlantic, so it concluded a ceasefire with Mexico. But Lorenzo had other plans. He initiated a series of skirmishes, after which he laid siege to the city of Puebla Puebla, the Mexican general Zaragoza had about 4,500 men at his disposal, stationed in a well-fortified position on 2 hills just northeast of the city. General de Lorenzo had 6,000 men. He immediately ordered a headlong attack against Puebla from the north, which was repelled. De Lorenzo then attacked again, bolstering his numbers by committing his reserves and orchestrating a diversionary attack on the eastern part of the city. Both attacks were initially more successful than the first, but they were repelled all the same. Nevertheless, de Lorenzo ordered a third attack, an ill-fated one as his artillery was out of ammunition. It was a complete disaster. Now it was Zaragoza's turn. It's the climactic counterattack you've been waiting for, with the French being attacked on both flanks simultaneously by the Mexican cavalry and charged head-on by the infantry. The festival of Cinco de Mayo is actually meant to celebrate this victory, not Mexican independence. But the war was not won yet. On the eastern coast of Mexico, the French expanded their foothold until the end of 1862. When Zaragoza died, the French returned to Puebla under a different general, Élie Frédéric Faure. He was in less of a hurry to take it, and in March 1863 he besieged the city with 26,000 men. After a grueling 2-month siege, the defenders, despite several relief efforts and sortie attempts, were forced to surrender in May 1863. The road to Mexico City now lay open to the French. In May, Juarez and the Mexican government took flight from the capital and made for Chihuahua. 1 week later, on June 7, 1863, French troops stormed Mexico City. The second phase of the French conquest of Mexico had now begun, installing Maximilian and keeping him in power. To convince him to take the crown, Napoleon provided him with results from a rigged election. He accepted the crown in October.
Yeah, Maximilian was actually a very, very liberal individual, despite being a member of the aristocracy. He believed in democratic values, in liberty for all people, fair wages. When he ruled Mexico, he got rid of things like child labor. He brought wages up. He instituted a lot of labor laws, things of that nature. Things that kind of made Napoleon a little uneasy, but people were kind of going for it, so he didn't interfere. But he was very uneasy with the thought of becoming an emperor of another land. He didn't quite like it, so Napoleon had a rigged election that showed the Mexican people wanted him to be the emperor. They wanted an emperor for this new empire. And of course the whole thing was false. The people didn't want him at all. But it convinced him to take the throne because he thought it was what the people wanted. He felt what the people, and Napoleon convinced them that's what the people needed, was a strong leader to bring liberal values and European ideals and European culture to them and all of this. So he ended up taking the throne under pretty much false pretenses. Pretenses that without he would never have taken the throne.
Of that same year, and began working on a series of progressive reforms, making the country more open to democracy, abolishing a Mexican form of serfdom, ending child labor, and even limiting work hours. Mexican conservatives lent him tepid support. French and Imperial Mexican forces remained victorious on the battlefield until the end of 1865, taking a number of cities and asserting control over Sinaloa and Jalisco. Their advance stalled thereafter, and in 1866, Juarez's Republican forces made a startlingly fast comeback armed with American dollars and weapons.
Napoleon took advantage of the American Civil War, knowing that with the Americans embroiled in a brutal civil war of their own, there was no way they were going to get involved against him in Mexico. There's just no way. Even if the Union wanted to, they would have to go through Confederate territory just to get to him, or they would have to go by sea and face down the French Navy, which the Americans really weren't ready to do. They were fighting against their own civil war, which not a lot of people realize, but had a very massive naval war aspect to it. So he really used that distraction to go after Mexico to really go after his ambitions. When the war ended, now the United States now was back along the border and told Napoleon, get out of the country. Get the French out of the country or we're going to invade. Mexican agents went to America to raise money for funding for weapons and things. The Americans sold them all sorts of kind of weapons, and the Americans had plenty of weapons left over from the war. So they were giving them all sorts of advanced new weapons and financial support. And very quickly, the tide turned, because the French troops did pull out. As soon as the Americans gave the ultimatum, the French troops were pulled out of the country, leaving only the Mexican loyalists, who never really stood a chance. And it was the French troops who were the real strong arm of that military occupation. And it's believed that the French intentionally didn't really train or arm the Mexicans super well, because they were afraid that they may turn on them. And if they did turn on them, they wanted to have that advantage to be able to beat them by being better trained and better equipped. So yeah, Napoleon really was an underhanded move right here to try to take Mexico. He was a very staunch supporter of the Confederacy. Partially because of this, he wanted the United States divided, and he thought that if he could, if the Confederacy were to win the war, the Confederacy would not get involved in Mexico, and he could try to support an ally. The ironic thing is that he never actually gave diplomatic support to the Confederacy, and had he done so, the Confederacy probably would have existed even if they took military losses, because it would have escalated the war from a civil war to a war between two sovereign nations, and it would have been unlikely that the North would have taken all of it back. So he really gambled a lot on the South winning without actually doing anything to help them win, which is sort of a bad move and a good indicator of how poor a leader that Napoleon III really was. He was not his uncle, let's put it that way. He was not a very good or effective leader, and we'll see that over and over again throughout his reign, all the way up until the end, which we will get to.
To that point, Americans had been busy fighting the bloodiest war in their history, but now that the United States were united once more, they were more than willing to enforce the Monroe Doctrine and thereby defend their southern border from European imperialists. Napoleon III was prudent enough to begin withdrawing troops, deciding that Mexico was not worth the damage to Franco-American relations.
Which weren't very much at this point.
By the end of 1866, Maximilian had been abandoned. After fleeing Mexico City and being besieged in Querétaro for a few months, the Habsburg prince, who had traveled the Atlantic expecting to be welcomed with open arms as the bridge between the Old World and New, was captured by Mexican forces. His execution took place a month later, resulting in the restoration of a Republican Juarez government and the end of French intervention in Mexico. If you want to learn more about the Franco-Mexican War, then I highly recommend you watch an episode called Napoleon III An Evaluation from Professor Robert Wiener's lecture series, The Long 19th Century, on the site of today's sponsor, The Great Courses Plus. The Great Courses Plus is a
Alright, so yes, it's a short but very good, informative video. The conflict itself wasn't very long. It was a long siege at the beginning, and then after that it was just a domino effect of Mexican cities falling to the French and coming under Maximilian's rule. But yeah, once the Americans stepped in and the French left, they really did abandon Maximilian. It's absolutely, they abandoned him, and they put Maximilian in charge because they had recently fought a war with the Austrians. And they were also both afraid of the rise of Prussia, who was trying to unify the rest of Germany into the German Empire, which they would eventually do. And they actually signed a defensive pact that if Prussia were to attack one of them, then the other would come to their aid. And to seal the deal, Napoleon decided to put an Austrian in power of a French territory in Mexico. So that was sort of seal the deal, but of course it backfires. And this is where my paper comes in, is that I talked about this in my thesis, and I pointed this out to be probably one of the most defining blunders of Napoleon's reign. He was always very unpopular. He made a lot of bad decisions. He's just not a very good leader at all. But this was really sort of the crowning achievement of how badly he screwed up, probably tied with declaring war on the Germans. But this whole campaign was a disaster. He went in there under the false pretense of getting the money back from Mexico, the way the British and the Spanish wanted to do. But then he kept conquering. The Spanish and the British backed out. And not only did they leave, but they were very upset with Napoleon. And they remained upset with Napoleon. They felt that they had been betrayed and they had been used. And they didn't like it. Once Maximilian had been abandoned and then publicly executed, of course Austria was very upset because a member of the royal family had been abandoned and allowed to be executed by the French, well, by the Mexicans, but the French were the ones that abandoned them, and they never really seemed to actually try and help him, which is very strange. They never really tried to get him out of there. They just kept him in power and left. But this point is probably the most important because he really pissed off everyone. So the United States is obviously pissed off at him because he invaded Mexico, violating the Monroe Doctrine, and they had also been supporters of the Confederacy. So there were some relations between French and Americans, but it was mostly trade and not much else. The British and the French were sort of frenemies until this point. They worked together on some things, but they were still definitely rivals because they were the two biggest imperial powers in the world. The Spanish actually looked up to the French a lot because the French were the biggest, strongest Catholic nation in the world, and Spain looked up to them for a lot of things, but they felt very betrayed by the French, and they were not expecting this kind of a move. Especially, they took a special offense that it was Mexico, which was a former colony of Spain, and whereas they didn't really seem to have any ambitions in actually going back and trying to retake Mexico or anything, it just sort of felt like a low blow to the Spanish that they were being used in order to recapture territory that used to be theirs, and they did a special blow to it. So come a few years later, when the Franco-Prussian War breaks out, I mentioned the defensive pact with Austria. Now that was a defensive pact. The French and the Prussians have been going tit for tat for a while. Otto von Bismarck, the leader of the chancellor of the Prussians, and sort of de facto leader of the rest of the Germanic states as they would ally together. He hated Napoleon. Napoleon hated him. They went tit for tat on a lot of things, and eventually Napoleon lost his cool and declared war on the Germans, totally expecting allies to show up. His whole strategy in the war was that they were going to sit back, they were going to hold their positions, wait for the Germans to come, hold them off, and sure enough, the Austrians were going to open a front on the other side. The British were going to send troops to help in, the Spanish were going to help them. Everybody was going to come to their help because the Germans were the bad guys and they were scary, and everyone was pretty uneasy with the growth of Prussia. But they were more upset with Napoleon than they were scared of the Germans at this point. So he got no help. He found himself facing down Prussia and all of his Germanic allies completely by himself, and the war was an absolute slaughter. It only lasted about 6 months, I believe, and the fighting lasted a month and a half, something like that. It was the siege of Paris that really escalated it. What happened was the Germans surrounded Paris and starved it out, forcing Napoleon to surrender. Napoleon kept refusing, while he was hiding away in a nice mansion in England, until eventually the Germans allowed French members of the government to go and basically bring Napoleon back kicking and screaming to sign the treaty, because the treaty would formally recognize the German Empire as a sovereign state, and then would force the abdication of Napoleon III. So they really wanted Napoleon to sign that. And they signed it in Versailles, which I think I've mentioned before is the first of many controversial treaties signed at Versailles. But yeah, this was an interesting topic for me, because when I did it in my paper, the professor I had was very adamant that this was an unrelated event. He disagreed with me completely on this matter. He was actually ready to fail me on the paper because he felt so strongly that I was wrong, and that the two events really didn't have anything in common. Whereas I made the argument, I pulled all the sources, that yes, he diplomatically isolated himself. And I think the real evidence comes from the siege of Paris. It went on for about 4 or 5 months, and at that point anybody could have stepped in. Austria could have stepped in, and they wouldn't have broken the siege, but they would have forced a lot of German troops to be pulled out of France and to fight on another front. And if Spain had gotten involved, or Britain got involved, if somebody got involved, it probably would domino to others getting involved. So if Spain gets involved, then Austria probably gets involved, and then maybe Britain gets involved. But nobody wanted to be that first guy. Nobody wanted to be the first domino. So nobody came to his help, and he was forced to surrender. And the professor and I completely disagreed on this. Like I said, to the point where he was ready to fail me over the topic. He was adamant, and we actually had to take it up the chain of command to the department heads to have it settled, because he was ready to fail me, and I was ready to just fight tooth and nail to get it done, because I really believed that this was the case, and I had a lot of historical evidence to back myself up, and a lot of other resources that agreed with me. I don't know why that was a hill he decided to die on, but he did, and I won. But it was so this particular subject, when I saw the video, I felt I had to do it because it has a little special place in my heart because of that whole situation. But yeah, anyway, back to the video. This was a very good, short, sweet video. There's not a whole lot to tell about this war. I mean, you can definitely elaborate on it in many areas, but it's pretty straightforward. There's not a lot of nuances in this conflict. It's more the after effects that are very, very important to world affairs, because the Franco-Prussian War completely changes the dynamic of Europe and all the way up to the 20th century. And it may have been a very different war had France not alienated all of their allies at this point, or potential allies at this point. So I'm going to end the video there. I really enjoyed this video. I think it was great. I definitely think I'm going to do some more by this guy. If you find any particular ones you want me to do, please put them in the comment section. I will definitely get to them. I found this video to be very short but very informative. I know he has a whole bunch of them. I just saw this one and I had to grab this one for personal reasons. That I can only laugh about now, but not so much then. But yeah, I'm going to end the video right there. If you like the video, please like and subscribe. I'll leave anything in the comment section that you want me to do. I also do alternative history videos, so if you have anything like that you want me to do, please put it in there. Check out my other videos, and I will see you next time.